In a game of chess, every player gets a total of 8 pawns, and white's pawns sit on the second row, whereas the black pawns sit on the 7th row of the chessboard. Each pawn is valued at 1 point. So a pawn, just like a soldier in the army, always moves forward. So a pawn always moves one step at a time on the chessboard. But if a pawn is sitting on its home square, now what do I mean by home square? Let me take these pawns backwards. Now all of these pawns are sitting on their home squares. Black pawns are sitting on the 7th row and white pawns are sitting on the 2nd row. So these pawns are sitting on their home squares, because this is their starting position when a chess game starts. So if a pawn is sitting on the home square, then it has the option of moving either one step forward or directly 2 steps forward. So since all of these pawns are sitting on the home squares, they can either move one step or they can directly move 2 squares at a time. Similarly, black can also choose to move one of these pawns either 1 or 2 square at a time. So if black wants to move this pawn forward, then he can move either 1 square or he can move directly 2 squares. Now it is white's turn to move. Let's say white wants to move this pawn to this square. Now black decides to move this pawn directly 2 squares ahead. So 1 and 2. Now it is white's turn to move, and white decides to move this pawn again. But now can this pawn move directly 2 squares ahead? No. Why? Because he is not sitting on its home square, it can now only move one step forward throughout the game. Now it is black's turn. Black decides to move this pawn, and this pawn can move how many steps? Well, since it's sitting on the home square, it can either move 1 square or it can move 2 squares. Let's say black moves it only 1 square. And now white moves this pawn 2 squares, black moves this pawn 1 square, this pawn 2 squares, and so on. So this is how a pawn moves. So the interesting thing about pawns is that they are the only chess pieces on the board that don't move backward. They always move forward like a strong soldier in an army. Now here we have reached an interesting position. It is black's turn to move, and black wants to move this pawn ahead in the game, but his way is blocked by the enemy pawn. So what does black do? Can black move ahead? No. Black cannot move ahead like this. Can black jump over this enemy pawn and come to this square? No. Pawns can never jump any piece on the chessboard. So what can black do? Well, he can't do anything because he's got blocked by the enemy pawn and he has to stay here as long as he can. Similarly, even this white pawn cannot move ahead because he is being blocked by the enemy pawn. Same is the case for this pawn as well as this pawn. And so is the case for all of these black pawns. They are being blocked by the white pawns on their way. So these pawns cannot move forward. So because these pawns cannot move forward, you must be thinking, then how do they capture enemy pieces? Well, that's an interesting question. Let's have a look at that. So, as you know, a pawn always moves forward, but when it comes to capturing, they don't capture forward, they capture diagonally. In this case, this black pawn cannot move forward, but if he wants to progress in the game, he can decide to capture this pawn sitting over here, because this pawn is sitting just 1 square away diagonally to this pawn. So, this black pawn can now capture this pawn over here. Similarly, this pawn can now capture this black pawn over here. This particular black pawn can also be captured by this pawn sitting over here because it is just 1 square away diagonally. So basically, this pawn can get captured now by any of these white's 2 pawns. Let's say whites decides to capture this pawn by this particular pawn. Okay? And now it is black's turn. So now, can this black pawn sitting over here capture this pawn? Well, the answer is yes, because pawns capture 1 square diagonally. Now it is white's turn. Can the white pawn capture this pawn? Well, yes. Let me give you an interesting puzzle. Now my first question is, can this pawn capture this enemy piece sitting over here? I'll give you 5 seconds to think. Well, the answer is yes, because this piece is sitting just 1 square away diagonally, so it can be captured. Let's move on to the next question. Can this pawn sitting over here capture this enemy piece sitting here? I'll give you 5 seconds. Well, this pawn cannot capture this enemy piece because though this enemy piece is sitting diagonally to this pawn, but it is 2 squares away from this pawn. So that is why this pawn cannot capture this enemy piece. If you have thoroughly understood the concept of how a pawn moves and how a pawn captures, then do give a thumbs up to this video and subscribe to my channel. And if you want to improve your skills in chess, I would recommend you to join one of my membership programs. In the game, it is black's turn to move and you have to tell me whether this black pawn can move 2 steps ahead. Comment with a yes or a no and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.